everyone, and welcome back to 93 Theory and Practice. I am your host, Zafanur Adonai, also known as Mike. So, what shall we talk about today? Well, overall, so far, it's a beautiful morning here in Texas. The birds are chirping. It's not too hot, though I know today is going to be a scorcher. So today, I think we're going to talk about religious devotion, the inflaming of one's being. So, as some of you may remember from the first podcast, religious devotion has been a bit of a part, has played a somewhat large part of my life. For me, it's always been a way of contacting the inspiration or the source of life. Not so much as weird and mystical as that sounds, if it does at all. But it's like you always have that one question of why. Why does all this happen? What's going on? Like, why am I here? Those sort of things. Now, when I contact deity, or at least in the traditional sense of devotion and worship, it's not that I get the answer of why I'm here, why things happen, but the internal conflict that is at play in that seems to dissipate, at least for that moment of touching the divine. I guess to elaborate more, the question no longer becomes relevant, because in a sense, I'm getting the feeling of tapping a truth. And that truth surpasses even the truth that I'm seeking in the question of the self. It's just that, I mean, if anyone's been a part of, say, any religious tradition that might employ, say, music, or chant, you get this sense of unity with others, but then there's a sense of unity beyond. It's that collective worship experience, I guess you could say. But in that, there's a disillusion of self into the body of something greater. Now, of course, there's the group psychology mentality of that, how the current of energy will carry from person to person when you compact individuals into confined spaces. People gain group mentality, group psychology, as opposed to individual psychology. So people will tend to want to act as a part of a group if you're confined within a group. Because evolutionarily speaking, if one were to stick out from the crowd, it would leave one vulnerable. If not to exilement, it would just leave one vulnerable to the outside forces, whether that be environment or being hunted or something like that. So kind of a weird correlation there, but essentially, regardless of how it's manifested, in a sense. So regardless of what you're experiencing, is just some form of propagation of thought through a multitude. There's a term, I think, for what I'm trying to say. I just can't find the term right now. But regardless of how it manifests, it definitely reveals something to us. That there is a different state of consciousness associated with not being in a group, although being in a group helps facilitate this type of consciousness. But the consciousness of the disillusion of self for the attainment of an other. So to me also, worship or devotion has revealed, in a sense, at least to me now. Now, of course, guys, I mention this all the time, or hopefully you've gotten the point by now, if you've seen more than one of these videos, that when I speak, of course, this is all coming from my own point of view. As much as I try and do maybe some teaching in this, it's all basically filtered through this thing that is called mic, and then even still filtered on a higher level through this being I call Zaphon or Adonai. So it doesn't. I don't know. I guess we'll try and distinguish what's me from truth as much as we can. But this is just right now. I'm going to speak from my own experience. But devotion to me has revealed, in a sense, kind of the aspects of love. And love in the sense of like even relationship love or sexual love. So, as we know, there's different forms of love. You can as you can intellectualize this force called love. Of course, you have like was it philia, which is like familial love. Please check this, make sure I'm not wrong. But you'll get the gist. Then you have eros, which is romantic love. You have, dang it, I know agape is like spiritual love, and then you have brotherly love, which is another one. I really wish I knew the Greek term. I can't remember right now. Man, my memory's acting a little weird today. But we push forward. So you have different types of love, but essentially what combined all those things into one for me is the understanding of it's almost like the basic understanding of the magnetic pole of the universe. So in Hermeticism, we learn, of course, the first thing. So like if you ever go on the internet and download a PDF version of like the Kabbalion, or the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, or essentially the original Book of Thoth, not the Aleister Crowley book on the tarot, which that is to me a legitimate Book of Thoth. I mean, it's a book of intelligence, but the Emerald Tablets, it will teach you essentially that as above, so below, as within, so without. You learn the aspect of polarity. Basically, everything is polar. So everything is polar in that as I try to empty myself of myself, to So let's talk about, like, in the sense of like a romantic kind of thing. When you have interest for someone, you pour out of yourself. So you display the aspects that you want to use as an enticing or a magnetic pull of said person's attention. On the opposite sense, if that is reciprocated, then that person will also display or pour out of themselves traits, qualities that they see would also be desirable by the other person. If that is reciprocated, then you have a magnetic play, a dance, an energetic link. From there, through interaction, you try to strengthen that link, to strengthen the channel of energy until, for some reason or rhyme, you decide to link completely and physically in some way. But also, there's a loss of the self in the process. It's in the aspect of falling in love. There's that feeling of, or just the desire to just become that other person, in the sense of just completely being enamored, in a sense. You're being that person, in a sense that's all you think about. It's basically what you feel is completely generated from the thoughts you have of this other person. It's essentially you're becoming consumed by this idea, by this energy that is now called this attraction, this beginning stages of love, falling in love. But it's real, it's tangible, it causes great alterations to psychology, to just personal energy levels. So you can literally stay up all night and not eat, and somehow find the energy to just do everything in your power to win this person over. So it's quite interesting, the effects of this thing called love. And what's interesting enough is that same power play, in a sense, that goes on in that action of eros, or romantic love, does have its root seed in that spiritual love of worship, of devotion, of agape, in that it reveals the polar, or the way of attracting or repelling a given force. So it's only when, for me at least, when I've successfully surpassed the idea of this person trying to contact something higher. So devotion's been a way of overcoming the intellectual aspects of religion, in a sense, of understanding doctrine and ritual and everything that encompasses that. I've always really enjoyed just knowing just knowing things and facts. I remember for a period when I was a confirmed and practicing Catholic, chasing the spirit through that alley of the church. I remember the thing I loved the most was just the pure devotion of it, and it's really easy to lose yourself in it all because it's quite alien. At least traditional churches are quite the decorum enables one to kind of go beyond the self. All the statues, basically you're surrounded by this alternate family in a sense. The Mother Mary, the Son Jesus, you have the stepdad Joseph, and then Father God, and it's quite nice and peaceful, and it helps facilitate that loss of self. But it's only when I've overcome the aspect of who I am. So like when the inertia, I guess you can say, when the inertia of reality, of the fact that I had to drive to that church, I had to get up and take a shower, and get nice looking to go, and probably have to eat something. I mean, all the stuff that just goes with being a carnal human that has needs and wants. And probably on the way to church, I got donuts and coffee and stopped, so I was a little late. It's like, it's difficult. But once that wave either pushes past you, or you've successfully just absorbed it and annihilated it, for me, it's then pretty quickly and pretty easily from there contact that first twinkling of divinity. So I guess I should maybe articulate what to me divinity is. So to me, it's I guess the way that I can describe it, I guess where I can convey it to someone else, I guess the best way that I can create a symbol of which I hope you will also extrapolate the same meaning and correspondence. But essentially, the way I view divinity is when you think of great people. So people that have done something beyond the human experience, generally, for the betterment of humanity or the world at large, or blah, blah, blah. Most of the time, for me, these type of people have been religious figures, in a sense, or at least figures that you learn about through myth and religion. Of course, how else do we get ancient history? But I've always thought, what enabled these people to do great things? And it first started off as my touch with divinity as a child. It's one thing when people tell you there's this God, and he is divine, and he has done all these great and numerous things. In fact, your entire existence was created by this being. Now, that's your first conception, generally, as a child of God, of deity. Is basically this creator being. But that's not really very understandable. Like, well, why did he create it? Who created God? Is generally a very childish thing to say, but also very true. From the mouths of babes come such great truths. So yes, who created God? But essentially, that's not knowable. So you come down to a next level of conception, which, as a child, your next level of conception of God is basically your parents, because literally they are the physical representation of where all life, sustenance, protection, and safety come from. Hopefully, although I do know in a lot of circumstances that's not the case for people. It's quite the opposite. So yes, we do the best with the cards we are dealt in life. But devotion in that respect, at least to me as an early age, revealed that to contact deity, it's this creator thing that made all this. There has to be to enable oneself to do these great things. These people were inspired. I always understood that this inspiration, this zeal, this energy force they were channeling must have been what enabled them. Now, remember as a kid, like, you would learn about your heroes of old, and you'd learn about heroes of old, but you would always correlate that with, say, like superheroes or mythical figures. And a lot of times those mythical figures, they either gain their powers from some sort of god or deity, or through some mishap. So, like, radiation, or being from another planet, or some outside influence has a play on their destinies, of which now has enabled them to do things that the normal person cannot do. So I remember being a kid and just being completely enamored with that idea, and being like, sweet, I want to know how to contact that source. So in reality, I had a bunch of people telling me everything. So the most powerful being in the universe is this being called God, who made everything. He made you and your whole life's purpose and blah, 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 all that stuff. So I wanted to know how to contact that guy. Or at least someone who knew that guy. Or I keep saying guy, but you get the ideas. You get the idea. I wanted to contact that being, that source. And that became a weird little pursuit. So, of course, prayer. So you'd pray, please talk to me, because then you'd learn that this being listens to you, and he wants to hear what you have to say for some reason. So slowly that evolved through learning about religion and being indoctrinated into various, religious beliefs. That evolved to creating a mask for that deity. But at least that mask was a way of communicating with that source a little bit more intelligibly. And what I mean by a mask is the method of arriving to that source. So the mask, in a sense, could be if there's this formless void that requires, but only because you require it, essentially, but requires an intellectual way of communicating with you. Remember, your brain doesn't have the ability to know the unknowable. It has to know something. Your brain is like it's a transceiver, but it has to focus in on something. It's static. It can't have static in a sense, or else consciousness isn't there. So it needs to focus in on a point. So it has to have a reference. So we formulate a image, a vestige, a symbol, or a mask for said voidless force, so that we can communicate with it, or at least so that it can communicate to us in a way that we can comprehend. We just need to understand. This is where, for me, magic has come, the correspondence of magic, understanding one's environment and the spiritual environment in which one wishes to traverse, has taught me to then use that to dissect the mask and then hopefully get more and more closer to truth tidbits from that source. So, in the aspect of devotion as worship, as this polar play of dance of desire, I will empty myself onto this great void, onto this great chasm of being, and usually that takes the form of some form of worship. And worship to me has always been a very sensual thing. I mean, what's more sensual than pouring oneself through poetic eloquence and song, to say, oh, I mean, I'm not going to start going into that. I almost broke out into odd song. But it's like that weird love play, that pouring out. And in that, once you reach the pinnacle, the height of that, then you can let go and accept. You've now become receptive. You've poured your cup out so that now you can receive the dew or the onslaught of the majesty of the Creator. So, we talk about, now I want to talk about, in magic, the way that we contact Source, Spirit. Of course, the pentagram rituals, the hexagram rituals, the middle pillar techniques of all those kinds are definitely ways of tapping Source. But for me, the most impactful way of understanding this, especially in a devotional sense, would be the bornless ritual. So the bornless ritual being basically, or also known as the headless ritual, the ritual of the headless one. But essentially it's contact with the self before the self beyond the self, the source of all things. Essentially, when you go through the bornless ritual, it plays a lot on the elements and duality. But duality being key. We learn that he is the creator of all life, the destroyer of our life. He, created men to love one another, to hate one another. There's this huge play on duality. But it's the attempt to contact that source through a naming of barbarous names and then a series of enchantments. I wish I had the ritual with me right now. We will. So we'll do a video on the bornless ritual, and we'll talk all about that. But just to give y'all an example, the bornless ritual kind of starts off with something like, I invoke the bornless one, thee that did create the night and the day, blah, blah, blah. Then there's an enchantment that says, hear thou me, and make all spirits subject unto me, so that all the spirits of the firmament, and of the ether, and under the earth, and of dry land, and of rolling air, and of rushing fire, and the great spells and scourges of God be obedient unto me. So that's like the incantations. That's the incantation to control the forces of the phenomena of the universe, blah, blah, blah. But then you have a series of barbarous names like Oro, Gogoro, Breo, Iao, Aurora. It's like all these weird secret names of God throughout time and aeon. But to me, the Bornless Rituals has been kind of like a weird, chanting, intellectual way of working oneself up in a fervor of, on one level, you're basically flashing, creating big flashes. Now, hopefully you would study the names, the barbarous names, of the ritual, and try and come up with correspondences of those names, or at least truths. So, as we learned, God names are generally, if you want to think, almost like an anagram for a force. So, like the letters of the name generally correspond to a particular force involved within that name. The name itself would generally, the meaning of that name would dictate that force of God. So in the same sense, these barbarous names are the barbarous names or the primal names of these God forces, under the aspects of, say, if you wanted to, in the light of like Liber Samek, how one would contact one's holy guardian angel or the bornless spirit. You would, it's in the form of elements. So the controlling of one's elements, the stilling of one's elements of oneself, so then to use that as foundation to have the higher viewpoint, or to attain or to invoke that higher aspect. But for me, it's been a way of like working that up. So as you flash these as you say these names, they flash the meanings within your magical memory, and they flash them within your astral projection, and they flash it within your own mental projection. And you're basically going through this cycle of like who God has been throughout the aeons, elementally and spiritually, and through the aeons dualistically, and how those things have enabled us to understand our natures, and then overcome those natures, and then become Godhead, or overcome self to obtain Godhead. Blah, blah, blah. So, but that always, to me, being the bornless one or the ritual of the headless one, basically showed an aspect of there's an egoless principle to it, of the giving up of oneself, or the surpassing of one's, at least the ego mentality of one's self, and then obtaining the identity of the one that has no head, who has surpassed the grosser or the more dense natures, and is now basically liberated oneself from the shackles of identity. So like I said, how does one obtain loss of identity? You could do it through a group, obtaining group identity. And then that group identity linking itself to obtaining to a deity, then that would become yours. So various forms. So you see where that all comes into play as far as worship and devotion. So it's even in that aspect of invocation and devotion, it's always been a very romantic, sensual, energetic play, because I've always seen it in the same light of that aspect of how you can think of love. So like eros. So as far as like familial love, family love, as far as invoking deity, just the one-ship one finds, the identity that one finds within the confines of a family structure, or whatever for you a family structure is, because a lot of times we pick our own family. So there are people out there that, like I said, aren't born under, I would say, ideal circumstances for growth, born into very bad homes, through no fault of their own. So, in a sense, those people may in life choose to choose a family, to take on others who they like, to their liking. So, but either way, that still is a loss of oneself, because you basically have a group of people, a tribe of people who are, through this greater concept of family, are willing to sacrifice of themselves for the betterment of the whole. It's basically a smaller play to the larger societal group setting. But then there's also this sense of interconnectedness. So in the aspect of a family, the father and the mother are the originators, the givers of life. The children are the successors of that life, the carrier on of whatever the family represents, whatever the gene line represents. And they are also the recipients of all of that. But in that same sense, the extended family is, you have the patriarchs, so you have the grandparents, which represent the elder life givers. I mean, there's this whole... Family represents something more than just a bunch of people getting together. It represents a model of life, how life comes into being, how life sustains itself, and then how life propagates further. Kind of has that aspect in family. It's that family structure. In that same sense, God is found in that, through what people are passing on because the individual dies, but it has the opportunity to propagate itself in others, in the form of family, so children, in a sense. Then that's how one would carry on. So you're passing on something almost spiritual. It's this spiritual identity, which is, or a higher identity, which for us in, I guess, Western culture, that would be like our last names. We're carrying on that last name. But that last name, it's something greater. So, of course, like me, Mike. And then my last name would represent something greater or something more beyond just the individual Mike. It would represent a series of, a series of original gene force being carried on through time. So it's a willed force having its trajectory through time-space. In the form of this family structure, or what the family structure I belong to. I know I'm probably getting way off the rails here, but in a sense, that family thing shows that there's something beyond. So if you can recognize that beyond and strive to that, you basically create something better. You create this loving structure of family, which you find help and support. And in that help and support, you get those feelings of realizing that deity is taking care of things. That for the last thousands of years, your family line has carried through this greater ideal of genetics, of evolution, and now you're here conscious, and in the same sense, that family structure, because it has been strong and has been blessed, you find divinity in that. So and then just in the union, like I said, getting into that group mindset, if you identify with the group of which you're around, that's generally a lot easier to form group mind, to form that psychology, so that when you can surpass the individual identity and then unite to the greater. So all of that comes into play. Those different forms of love come into play when it comes to devotion. Whoa, magic cup. So these forms of love help reveal ways of obtaining divinity, or at least aid for me in understanding how to obtain to that. So, like I said before, divinity is like this thing that allows people to do things great. So in the form of like family, of group mindset, essentially that greater thing is understanding that we are all part of a species of beings that has a will of its own and trajectory of time-space, and that by sacrificing at least some of the freedoms of the individual or the individual itself, we wish to continue the propagation of that greater force. And in that, we can, in that devotion to that force, in the form of sacrifice, we unite, in a sense, a little bit with that force and share in its majesty. So that force being something that enables greater things to happen, greater phenomenon, at least into the human perspective. It's been a way of surpassing just the normal conditions of life. Because there's something that's definitely gained in contacting that. There's something that's implanted. The whole concept of the Eleusinian mysteries, of the old Greek mysteries, essentially the invocations to the planetary forces, the planetary gods, was basically you would invoke that force so that a little bit of that force would be implanted, like a seed force within you. Thus, every contact with the deity would make you a little bit more divine. I've come to understand this a little bit and see it as a weird kind of truth. And the way that I can intellectualize it is every time we successfully surpass the idea of ego, so disillusion the self, and make contact with either one, the group self, so the universal self, the net of self, being in more finding contact with the greater organization of identity, or with trying to identify with deity. But essentially, in the dissolution of self through any means, I think that there's a strengthening of will, or an enlivening of self in some sort of way. Think of it this way. Identification. So we learned that suffering is innate in the universe because it is the ego that suffers. So if there is no ego, there is no suffering. But as long as there is an ego, there will be suffering. There will be hurt. But I think the more often one transcends that source of hurt, that source of disillusion, or that of illusion, I should say, the more that we separate ourselves from that and contact the one source or a greater source, then we start to identify with that more, at least on a subconscious level. And I think that has a beneficial effect, or at least I've found it to have a beneficial effect. I mean, heck, I've very rarely just been going about my normal identified as Mike Day and had great revelations on shit that I've been trying to work out. I mean, it does happen. Sometimes you'll just be walking down the street or doing your work, and then one day you'll be like, you know what? I was a really big dick about that. I should probably apologize to that person. But more often than not, when having these transcendent experiences of which I am no longer consciously viewing everything from the viewpoint of this ego mind, but viewing it from a higher aspect, or at least trying to contact or contacting that higher aspect, when I do come back down a little bit, I do usually receive something like, hey, flash of this person, you know, hey, reconcile this energy, blah, 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 whatever it comes into play. But that might not be the experience for some people, but it has been for me. And to me, that's been beneficial because it's helped me to kind of overcome slowly through time and through devotion those obstacles that keep me from really connecting with people, connecting with myself, my environment. And also transcending myself, the parts of myself that cause me hurt to myself. Because I realize that even this shell of a person is still integral and necessary for expression to other beings, but also, if I so desire, because I have been successful in this, I can transcend that and find refuge in something greater. So it is a little bit of an escape, but also that escape allows a further and a deepening understanding of what I am trying to escape from. And also, it helps me feel more in contact with others, because that great source is in others, and comes from others, and is everything. So, I think the only justification I have, in way of like always of jumping in a sense from devotion to devotion, being, you know, say Christian to having Hindu devotion to Buddhist devotion to random magical devotions to Thelemic devotions to just you know what I mean, just from this weird evolution of my conception of deity. The only justification I think that I've had in that to myself has been that I've always been trying to chase a source. It's a truth that I can't comprehend, but I can give it comprehension through these various forms. Much like, yeah, God's been kind of like, if you want to think, like an enchantress that through time and space takes on various forms. Pulls me and entices me to then just move on to something else. Like a weird dance of seduction. But either way, it's always played into that. So it's that mentality of divinity has infected every aspect of thought. And that's made life a little bit more sacred, because just the innate human experience, the things that we go through, still have their root in the universal experience. That we share these experiences with other people. Those people make up a larger group, which represent a larger force or phenomenon, which is representative in a larger creator phenomenon. But this is where I see the practice, just the overall practice of devotion, and devotion to a practice in the form of, like, say, specifically meditation. The ability to still the foundations of oneself. Because honestly, if you're going to excite yourself, you're kind of like a shooting arrow. The excitement is kind of like the path of Sagittarius on the tree of life that links Yesod to Tifereth. It's like an arrow. It can be easily missed. You know, you could shoot off in the wrong direction. Luckily, God is everywhere. So if you're going to aim and hit, you're going to get something, generally. But if you're going to do that, you need a good, stable foundation. If you have a good, flat surface, a good level plane, and you attempt to shoot straight up, well, you're going to go straight up. You're going to hit your mark. An uneven foundation, an incomplete foundation, causes the deviation in aim, in which one would find oneself getting lost in the veil. But either way, the meditation helps instilling oneself. At least if you can approach devotion. So if you can't be part of like a group mindset that then transcends that into contact with deity, then at least you can still your own foundation enough to surpass the ego a little bit. I mean, isn't that like the whole pull of psychedelic drugs? You trip out so bad that you completely dissolve away and gain contact with this great cosmic technicolor force. I mean, yeah, that's what you're attempting. You meditate to still the mind, to still the body, the soul, the spirit, and to try and contact that source of peace. Yeah. I think that's in the condition of when we do our banishing rituals, or at least our pentagram rituals and our hexagram rituals, we're attempting to equilibrate, still, and balance those aspects of ourselves so that we have a firm foundation of which to work on. I mean, essentially those rituals are a way of transcending from Malkuth up to Yesod. So Yesod being the realm of the foundational realm, so the foundation of the elements, is another key phrase for Yesod. That being basically the perfected elements, so the stilled or however your built up conceptualized elements of which you're now ascending up to, in a sense. But the pentagram rituals is kind of a way of doing that, either by invoking the greater elemental forces from above to fill in deficits, or banishing to level the playing field. But essentially that's what you're attempting, so that then you have a stable foundation of which to do your hexagram rituals, or your devotional ritual, of which to then shoot up through Sagittarius, or the path of Samak. I hate how I always start getting all weird and technical and Kabbalistic eventually. I'm sorry, guys. But yeah, that's meditation in a sense. Is just that. If you can't sit there, you can do a ritual. You can do active meditation, and you can produce the same effect. Contact with the stilled self, which even then you get a glimpse. Remember, the moon is still an image of the sun. It's the reflective deity of the sun's energy. So we can contact truth through the moon. It's still an illusion, but in a sense, but it's still the solar light, much like us. So even and then, there's a touching to that divinity. There's a twinkling. Hey, even in Malkuth though, man. Remember, Malkuth is in Kether. Kether's in Malkuth. As above, so below. So in each phase, there's contact with deity, and I think in each phase there's an aspect of love. So, Malkuth, I would say, would be maybe like familial love, and then Yesod would be maybe brotherly love. Tifereth would be maybe familiar love, and then maybe somewhere up there in Doth realm is some other type of love, Eros. No, I don't know, or somewhere mixed in there is Eros, but then at the top in Kether, we have I would say this, in Kether we have Eros, and then at the very tip of Kether, right before it's the Ein Sof and Ein Sof Or, we have agape. Is that a good way to put it? I think so. I like that. But that is devotion. It's as we understand the various aspects of love, we understand the various aspects of devotion, and then we understand the various aspects of divinity and how to contact and obtain divinity. And that's all through varying forms of love. So we impact and strengthen our love muscles. Yeah. Because if you don't love something, you're not going to sacrifice yourself for it. And isn't it true? The ultimate attainment is ultimately a sacrifice. It's the giving up of oneself completely into the cup of Babylon, entirely. So, on that, I'll end this podcast. Do what thou wilt should be the whole of the law. Love is the law, love under will.